What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy and welcome to the channel. If you had just seen the video that I just put out, then you would know that I'm kind of in the midst of covering different synthesizers that Bitwig has to offer, just because I feel like it's kind of time to maybe revisit some of these things that is available in the DAW, especially if you're considering picking this up or if you haven't maybe had the chance to demo it. I love to inform you all about my favorite pieces of software, which obviously is Faceplant and Bitwig respectively. So if you have also been keeping up with the channel, you know that I just recently released a brand new preset pack, which is called Aegis, that is Neuro-based tools for something like Bitwig. I also have stuff available for Faceplant, but I wanted to cover why I went over, or why rather I used the Polymer aspect for making this stuff as opposed to any other first-party synth. And the short answer is that I kind of decided to choose just one and stick with that, so that way you didn't have to like load in a bunch of different presets. But the other thing is that even though Polymer is incredibly simple, it can still do some really amazing things when you start to think about how to connect the dots with everything that Bitwig has to offer as a whole. So in context, this is just one sound from my pack, and if you just play a single note, it's a simple respace. Then if you turn a knob on, it will do some complex filtering, kind of like what we did in the last video. Then we have this map to a Neuro generator to where you turn this on and it does crazy unpredictable effect processing. Lots of crazy cool things in that, and of course, as stated before, I chose Polymer to do so. Now, the reason why is because I actually want to draw a parallel between Polymer and Faceplant. And I'm not saying that you should necessarily compare the two in between, but if you look at a similar preset that I have on any of this stuff, maybe let's say we go to the Eternum 3 pack, we go to this, and we pull up one of these, you'll notice that I've got a wavetable, a filter, saturation, this is a dedicated sub, and maybe another filter. But this generative section right here is actually very reminiscent of what we have here. And just starting off with the very basic synthesizer, we've got a dedicated sub, we've got a filter, and then we add some distortion on the end of that. Pretty much allows a very similar workflow approach towards something like Faceplant. Now, for whatever reason, if you need to do more processing or you need to have a more complex chain, you can always group this and set these in parallel. However, I think that it's really important to kind of just start with getting a good sound from the basics first, as opposed to, you know, just trying to go crazy as you can and then just like copying everything you see. So you might have guessed it, we're going to make a bass today, but before you do that, maybe consider liking and subscribing if you like what you've heard so far. And without further ado, I don't know, check out everything that I have to offer on my website because there's a lot of really cool content. Now, starting with this section here, I'll kind of go over some of the basics of it, and it won't be a comprehensive guide by any means, but it's actually really cool. So the reason why I like this is because all of these are kind of individualized into kind of, I almost want to say modules, and these three in particular are interchangeable. So right now we have this set to a pulse. Obviously it's going to create a square wave, but we have sawtooth, sine, wavetable, triangle, phase one, and a swarm. I actually really like this one. I should do more on that at some other point. But the one that we're going to focus on today is the wavetable, because likewise, just like Faceplant, you can use different wavetables and stuff to your own liking. Unfortunately, Bitwig does not have a wavetable maker, to which that almost seems criminal. I guess actually Ableton doesn't either, so there's that. But typically what I do is I'll make a wavetable within Faceplant. You can use Serum or Vital. Vital is free, and then you can kind of just drag and drop that in here. If you don't know how to do that, you can go import and then find wherever your wavetable is within your library, and then it'll pop right up. Now, one thing that I've noticed between Polymer and something like Faceplant is that my wavetable sounds so fat whenever I load something in. So this is the Eternum 3 tables. We can just load up the first preset, and maybe it's because of the dedicated sub. Actually, we'll turn that off, but take a listen to how big this is. That's huge. There's no gain boosting, there's no any kind of processing other than a limiter, and it already sounds super fat. And so that is something that's already a key characteristic to why I like Polymer so much. It's just the algorithm in which the way that it translates wavetables to sound, and it just sounds really good. So the other thing with that though is that when you combine the ideas of the detuning and all that stuff, we get, again, a really awesome, amazing sound. Now, there's a couple of different ways to do this, and you might want to pick one or the other depending on what you're going for. The first over here is having a unison setting. So you click on this little thing right here, and we can go into 3 voices, and we can turn the spread down, and we can just kind of demo these modes quickly. And I like that it has a couple of different options to choose from. However, there's this pretty much, not necessarily a secret one, but another one that you can do with this, where you go and you add the pitch to this, and you set this to maybe say 30, and then you want to go into the voice stacking over here up to the left, and then turn the voices to 1, and this will actually create a different kind of unison. And generally speaking, that's the one that I usually go for because, as you can hear, it has the most phase oscillation. Yeah, that's huge already. So within that, we also have an FM, or rather a pulse or phase modulation knob right here that you can dedicate this to the sub. And so if you have just a little bit of sub going on, and let's say you want to high pass this or whatever, then we'll talk about that here in a second. But typically speaking, for whatever reason, if this wavetable isn't thick enough, then you can add your dedicated sub here. And I like that they give you a couple different octave options in case if you want to maybe say play a higher note here. I'm going to turn this down just a bit. A higher octave here. And now you're able to kind of separate those and play out different things. Again, it's nothing necessarily unique, but at the same time, it's a nice feature to kind of be aware of. If we, how do I say this? Like, one cool feature about this that I really enjoy though is that contrary to FM4, which you can only use sine waves at first to apply the modulation or to apply the FM, the frequency modulation, you can use these different waveforms in order to create your FM source, so that gives it an extra edge in comparison to something like FM4. And then of course you have a wavetable, so it becomes a little bit different. Now outside of the box, you can't really, do like insane, crazy FM to FM. Again, we'll talk about that here in just a second. But for just getting a sound started and just getting things up and going, to me, this is a great starting point to be like, all right, well, I'm just going to use this and then start to apply, any other kind of effects that I have in general. So if we were to apply a little bit of FM, again, it sounds nice and fat, and then we can always use that dedicated sub. So I'm going to turn this off for now, and what I'm going to do is create a macro here. And what we will do with this is we're going to use this as our activator. Now, the next thing that I'm going to pull up is a randomizer, because this is going to help us out here in just a second. You know that randomizers are my favorite thing about Bitwig. This is like, this little guy right here just changed everything in how I do sound design, and I would highly encourage you to get familiar with it because it'll change your life. So with that, what we're going to do is kind of just set this to a relatively slow rate, and then we are going to activate this with the depth and turn this down. So that way, whenever we turn this on, it'll activate that. Now with this, we are going to actually apply this to the FM here by just a small amount. And whenever I turn this on, it's going to pretty much randomize the FM amount. Perhaps, maybe it takes a second to activate. So you can hear how it's kind of transforming and giving it kind of like a noise type of sound. So the other thing with this is that we've got a few different filters to choose from. I typically go for XP because the notch on this sounds really good, but keep this in mind because sneeze coming, excuse me, because this for one sounds the best, but whenever you change these modes, that's not the only thing that you have. So you can cycle through a low pass, LD, SK, which kind of gives you these definitions that you can take a look at here, SFV or SVF. I think this is actually based off of, SVF is, I want to say Ableton's filter algorithm. And then you also have a comb filter. So it's only one, but at the same time, this is a perfect setup because this will help you take out a notch when you are using some kind of respace or something, and that actually is one of the key factors in creating more movement. So we can kind of find maybe a spot around the low mids, and you'll notice that it's going to accentuate the phase movement or the phase oscillation from the bass. And the reason why is because typically speaking, whenever you have a huge wavetable like that, you've got these peaks and resonances within your low mids that make it kind of almost sound like full to your ears. And so when you remove that, it keeps the signal relatively clean, and then of course allows you to kind of like, allows the, I guess, the phase to cut in and out at a more clear state. So just keep that in mind in case if you're ever thinking about doing that kind of stuff. But some other cool features about this is that you can drive this. It's a pre-drive, unfortunately, but you can also key track. So if you are using F or whatever, then you can kind of set this here and adjust it so that way it'll somewhat follow that. And I'm not really sure how to set the root node. You can always do key tracking with the modulator, but at the same time, you know, it's just a nice feature to have just to kind of be like, all right, well, I want this to somewhat change whenever I play a different note. There is the envelope right here that you can set the amount to, which goes in right here. And then of course you can add this envelope to just about anything else. And then you actually have your dedicated ADSR over here to which you can change this between these different things. And one thing that I want to point out with this as well is that you can see that there are all these different options because it's designed to make very simple sounds, but like give you all the shortcuts to that. And if you're brand new to sound design, this is probably one of the best tools that you can use because it will teach you, I would say like 70% of like the sound characteristics that are typical within electronic music. You know, you've got pads, you've got plucks, you've got, you know, leads, you have your basses, you've got arpeggiators, all that kind of stuff. And this is kind of designed to be like, all right, what's the fastest way that we can get you up and going? The other features that you have are a dedicated high pass filter, the glide over here, and then you can change the pitch. So within this will be extremely useful to us here in a little bit. So put that in your pocket. And then the last thing that you have is this little noise generator here. So if you want to make it a little bit brighter, you can do that. But I would say that this thing gets really loud very quickly. So be kind of, I guess, sparing with it. You also have a sync over here if you would rather do that. So instead of doing FM, you can sync this. And then some index things that we can talk about, I guess I'll go ahead and give you the secret now, is that you can actually take a look at this by changing it into a grid in the future if you wanted to, and change a lot of the aspects of that. And we'll touch on that here in a little bit. But what's cool about this though in particular is that by sliding through the index and all that other stuff, you can actually kind of move everything with interpolation of tables and spread each one out if you have multiple voices via the unison. You can't do it if you're doing it the way that we are now. But what that basically means is you've got 3 voices or more, and it will kind of spread this out across the wavetable so that way you're playing all the different aspects of that. And then you've also got these different phase modes on here. That's also really cool. I generally leave it on the wavetable values here in this way. So it's really neat in this sense, and there are some simple but powerful tools that you can use with that I would encourage you to just like, don't even worry about trying to do crazy stuff. Just spend some time within this and try to get a really fat sound. You won't have to go very far. So my typical processing isn't too different than what we've done from before. We're going to use a saturator here. And before we do that, I'm going to use an EQ plus because we're going to do some boosting. I'm actually going to turn my volume down because my partner's asleep, but I'm going to boost this up here and then grab myself a notch, kind of like this, and this will make this really big. There we go. So now with this, you can see that whenever you apply drive, it adds more gain reduction. So I'm just going to hit undo and instead just pull the gain reduction back up a bit. And I don't really know how this works. And if somebody is watching, I'd be happy to see this. But for some reason, when you pull the low pass filter up, it actually makes it more like crunchy and like more unpleasant. And if you pull the low pass down, it actually makes it cleaner, but seems like a more drive. But in any case, with this, you actually have different pulls that you can do with this. So give that a try if you're messing around. But typically I just drive this up a bit and then I pull the quiet sounds or the quiet part of a sound up. So we make kind of like a S in that way. Now you can also adjust this if you want to, because you can boost the quiet sound. You can also change the needs, kind of smooth everything out. I typically do something kind of like that. And then this is the same thing, but with the loud parts of the sound. So Now with this, it will kind of set us up to kind of get into our complex filtering, which we'll do in just a second. But sometimes you might want to mess with this and start to see where these different boosts and notches are, because it will affect how the sound comes out. Sounds pretty good to me. Now with this here, we are kind of using this as a base set, and something else too is that the more that you drive into this, the more that it's going to kind of like sound chunky, which you can definitely overdo. But if we use maybe a triangle and we pull the sub into this, let's see what that sounds like. Sweet. So let's go ahead and get into our filtering now. What I'm going to do is pull up my favorite thing, which is the Effects 3, and this is just an excellent tool because it keeps everything clean for one, but allows you to only focus on independent frequencies. So I did this in my last video, but basically I leave the sub alone. I process the mids the most, and then I do a little bit of processing to the high end. But what's cool about this is we can actually move this over here, and whenever we set the amount, we can turn this up. And now this is mapped to activating the Neuro rack. Except one thing that's really important is to make sure that this is going to be inserted with the effects here. So sometimes if you're trying to put modulators into something else, it doesn't work unless if it's nested, is what it's called. So one thing that you can do is either use an instrument layer and go over the entire thing, or you can nest everything within the Polymer device, or usually any other synth that's got that little effects thing there. So you'll see this turn blue now, and now I can activate that, and it's a lot easier to work with. So the other thing that I'm going to do with this as well is I'm going to duplicate this, and because I already have this set up, you'll see here that when I turn this up, that this will activate too. So anytime I duplicate this randomizer here, I can apply this with different settings to different stuff. It will pretty much be like all mapped to that one, and that's a really awesome tool. However, one thing that I'm going to take a step back and do now, just for the sake of organization, is I am going to map another macro here to the pitch. And we're going to set this into bipolar mode because we want to be able to go both up and down. But with this here, I'm going to take this on the Hertz value and move this up. So that way, whenever this turns up, maybe we want to turn it down. You can see that whenever we move the rate here, it's actually going to speed this up. So what we can do in order to make this match the phase oscillation is move this with the pitch up to maybe, let's say, 24 semitones. It doesn't need to be precise. But now, whenever I play this, if this is activated and I change the rate, then it is going to play with the pitch. And that's a really cool tool that you can kind of use and implement to make things kind of work. So this little characteristic here between all this stuff is really important because we're going to use the same tool between everything else that we're going to do for the rest of this sound. For one, I'm going to kind of grab one of the same or similar processes of this and map this here. And then I'm just going to grab another macro like this and set this to bipolar. And we're going to do the same thing to where we set this to Hertz and change, or automate rather, the rate. Now, I'm not going to be too worried about the overall macro stuff here because if I turn this off, I don't need to turn this stuff off. It's already going to be deactivated, so there's that. However, I will grab this one here and activate this to the rate, so that way whenever we turn this up, it'll pretty much match across there as well. Now that we have that, maybe we might want to grab a couple of these and we can start to use this to map other parameters that we will have within the device here. Now on the low end, the only thing that I'm doing is just making this in mono. I usually leave it untouched. You can add a little bit of saturation if you want, but I typically don't. Now on this stuff, the mids is usually where the magic is. So what we'll do is open up with an EQ plus. And this is kind of where we get into our complex filtering. This has been my go-to thing so far. And the reason why is because it usually just makes the most sense for me. So we're going to grab one of these randomizers and move this up. So that way we're sweeping across the low mids, and then we're going to use this and pull this further down. So that way these create an interaction somewhere in the middle. I'm going to move that a little bit more so that way it's a little bit more intense, I guess. And again, we don't really have to worry about this coming down all the way here because this is on the midband. So you can pretty much go as crazy as you want with it. Now that we have that, we've got that second modulator here, but we can try to find these little peaks and stuff around here to create vowel tones. And this is something that's pretty classic from any Skrillex bass or something, and I'm sure somebody out there is still Googling on the internet how to do it, and if you just so happen to stumble upon this video, then you are in luck. There we go. So now with this, you can see that we've got some other boosts and notches and stuff, and then these two are sweeping across, so we've created an interaction. However, we're going to make this a little bit more intense, or a little bit more, how would you say, prominent by boosting this here, and then pulling these down here, and then boosting this up here. So that way now we've got this morphing sound in between all of this that is going to help shape the sound even more. Let me make sure that this is on. It is. And you can see that it's starting to create really, really high resonances and stuff. And so the only thing that we're going to do with this is just back off of it a bit. And what I want to do is make sure that this is not in bipolar, because I don't want it to be that high. And then maybe I can just reduce this just a bit. There we go. And you can see that this notch is being boosted really high. So what we want to do is come back to this and adjust it just a bit, so that way it's not quite going so high. There we go. So now within this, you can hear that in some places it's still kind of resonant, and you can fiddle around with this as much as you want, but I have a feeling that it'll be fine. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use a regular filter, and the reason why is because this actually has drive both on pre and post to it. So unfortunately you don't have you can't do drive to this other than boost the actual volume, but there's a clear difference between pushing the gain up and actually adding a means of distortion to that. So what we're going to do from there is pretty much just grab one of these. It doesn't really matter, but I'm going to kind of move this in succession or in opposition towards this one here. So if I move this up, you'll see that this is going to kind of sweep along here. And unfortunately, you can't see the filter line, but you can see that the little blue thing is moving. So what we can do is grab that and then push maybe the post out of that. So we are taking stuff away, but we're also kind of bringing some of it back with distortion, and this is kind of the name of the game with this kind of sound. There we go. Now, even though we've created those crazy resonances and stuff, we can fix that with one of my favorite tools of Bitwig, which is the Chorus Plus. And the reason why I like this so much is because, for one, it's new and it's nice and shiny, but the way that this sounds within all of this actually helps the phasing and will actually help accentuate a lot of these movements and sounds. So, for example, what I typically do is set this to the 8 voices mode and then turn the width down. But if you take a listen, that automatically makes it sound more monstrous. So if we automate this mix just a bit, pull the depth a little bit up, then whenever we turn on this macro here, then you can see that it's going to help kind of smooth all that stuff out. So I might play with moving this over to the side because I want this to cut through everything else. There we go. And then what I will also do is maybe play with a little bit of distortion here as well. So I've talked about this before, and this is pretty overlooked because when you first hear it, it's very harsh. And that's usually not very desirable. But what you can do is you can set the low and high threshold here, and then you can actually use this as a notch, just as we did with this one, except it's got a different kind of distortion mode. So sometimes that can be pretty useful. So what I'll do is I'll grab this one here and I'll move the frequency line up this way. And now, as you see, this is going to actually apply distortion across this band that we are filtering out. Now, the way that I like to use this and actually make it work is that, for one, the drive is usually way too high, so just back off of that and then turn the slew up. Now we're going to slowly introduce this until we find something that's nice and thick. You see, like, even that was already too much. So what we want to do now is just back off of this just a bit. And now you can hear that we've got a pretty interesting sound just from distortion and filtering combined. So the last thing that we want to do is we want to kind of focus on the high band here. And for this in particular, there's a lot of different stuff that we can use, but I'm just going to reach for an amp. And the last video that I did, I kind of did everything in opposite, where I used the distortion on the high end and I used the amp on the mid band. But for this in particular, I'm going to kind of just leave it as is, not really focus on that. I'm going to make sure that both of these are even and turn off the mix. And then I'm going to mess with the sag and the bias here. So the other thing that is really important that you can do is you can solo this. So I can turn this off and just listen to it now. And maybe what I might also do is turn this on. Oh, unfortunately, we don't have a shelf on that, but that's okay. We can kind of come over here and just dip that just a bit with the mid signal.
Recording to logbook.
Sorry, somebody just followed. And now I'm just going to mess with the sag here and the bias. The other thing that we can do is play with different modes here within the distortion type, so that's really fun. And you can see that we're kind of just trying to make this a little bit more crunchy. And this is really just going to be to how you like it. And it doesn't really matter. There's not really a right or wrong. It's just kind of saying, okay, well, what can we do with this to make it more interesting? Now that we have that, we can bring back the other elements. And for the most part, this is relatively complete. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of take a shortcut here and pull up one of my racks that we use. We need an effects 2, and all this is kind of like effects 3, except the low band is at 125. I'm going to move this to 140. And then on the high band here, I actually add a reverb and a low pass filter. So I pulled up the wrong preset, forgive me, but this is the filter verb. And again, we'll pull this down to like 140 or so. Low end is mono. Then on the high end, we've got this reverb here that we can use to manipulate, maybe pull back the diffusion, mess with some of the settings, but you can see that this is going to filter the top end. And this is like the cherry on top, because this is what's going to help the sound actually kind of morph. There's a lot of cool movement in the middle and stuff, but what's happening is that the low and the top end are always open. Generally speaking, I leave the low end by itself because I always want there to be sub, I always want there to be bass, so that way the sound always has a presence. But when it comes to different kinds of filtering and stuff, you kind of want to shape the top, the mids and the top, in order to kind of create the most interesting movement. So you'll see what I mean here in just a second, but let me mess with the reverb for a bit and see if I can find something that I'm happy with. The other thing that we need to do as well is that we need to turn the amount here into the mix, so that way everything is going to turn on with itself. So if I turn this off, it's just going to be the normal Reese, and then if I turn this on, The other thing is that I've got these modulators here that are already set, so you can see that I'm messing with the cutoff and then I'm messing with the mix. That way everything isn't set to 100%, but I've already done myself a favor and added the little rate thing right here. So all I have to do is kind of match that up, and then I can set this to 100%. So that way whenever I pull the rate up, it's going to match the speed of these as well. Okay, so I do like this, but unfortunately this is kind of like floating around the top too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flip this a bit and try to pull this downward instead. And the reason why is because this, let me make sure that this isn't set to bipolar. Okay, so because this is not set to bipolar, it means that it's never going to be past, like the mix is never going to surpass this amount. So I'd much rather it start closed and have closed space and then open up, as opposed to always kind of having a super large tail. The other thing that we can do is we can mess with a little bit of the pre-delay and size. It's kind of, you just kind of have to listen to it, and then maybe just a touch of build up. I'm going to actually turn this down on the resonance, and I'm going to push this back a little as well, and then that will hopefully close more of the sound out. There we go. So as you can hear, we're already almost there. Next thing that we got is another effects 3. And what this is going to do is just boost the high end just a touch. And you don't really want to go too crazy with this, like just a little bit. But we're going to pull up the dynamics here. Oh, man. Botch that. And we're just going to push the threshold of the top end just a little bit. You can see that the signal is kind of riding along this line here, and what's going to happen is whenever it hits the curve, it's actually going to boost it. So we want to push the threshold back just a bit, and you can see that that already boosted the sound. You really want to be careful with this one though, because you can easily just like overdo it and potentially hurt your ears. So either A, turn it down, or once you get used to it, you can kind of mess with it in that way. But we're not really looking for a super OTT. We're looking for like a subtle TT. Maybe a little over the top, not over the top. So in saying this, this is pretty much the sound. It's almost complete. The last thing that you might maybe want to consider is just doing a little bit of EQ. And in fact, let me show you that, because that's a cool trick. Just because if you're this far in the video, then you're probably going to want to soak in as much as you can. But within this here, this is really interesting because we can use something called an envelope follower, where it reacts to the sound. So if you recall back when we made some of the sounds here within the effects 3, that sometimes we can get that crazy resonance here in this area. So all we have to do is click on this little guy and map this to the gain. So that way, whenever it gets too peaky, we're just going to reduce it a little bit. And you can see that whenever I let off of that, then it comes back up. And you can change the settings on this. I keep clicking into new notes, sorry about that. You can change the settings on this, but I typically just, leave it as is. But this is a great way to create a dynamic EQ in case if you don't have Pro Q3 or something. It's just a quick hack. So after all that, it's being sent in through a limiter. You might want to turn the limiter just a little bit down, but you pretty much have your Neuro base that you can start implementing and supplying. But that's only half of the video. Just kidding. We're going to wrap this up, but just as a means of places of exploration, once you have this crazy rack set up and you've got all that stuff going on, then what you do is you click on this guy and you go right click and you go convert to polygrid. Now, whenever I click on this, you'll see that we can pretty much get into the insane modulation that Bitwig has to offer. And so one thing that we can do right off the bat is we can right click, go to oscillator, and grab ourselves another wavetable. We can find ourselves one of my wavetables just because, well, I made them, so why not? And instead of doing FM with a single triangle wave, we can actually pull this here and do FM with this instead. Now, this is really cool because we've already got these modulation parameters set up, right? So even though this is no longer going to be modulated with the sub oscillator, whenever I turn this on, this is actually going to be still modulated with the wavetable instead. So what we can do is we can find something that we like here, and that almost completely transform the sound just by doing a very simple step. The other thing that you can consider with this is that instead of doing a single filter, kind of like what we had talked about before, you can actually set this up and duplicate this into another section here. So this actually created a parallel chain. As you can see, this is going here, this is going here, it doesn't have an output. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to route this back into this one, and now we can see that we've got a notch filter, another notch filter that we can also modulate. Now, one thing that I might do instead is just use a peak, and the reason why is because I kind of want to see if I can make these two match against each other when the low mids. So what I'll do is I'll grab this same modulator, because we don't really need to do anything else after that. I'm just going to move that up here, so that way these two are going to be pit against each other. Pretty cool. Now the other thing with that we can also do, which is really neat, is we can add in that distortion that I said that we were missing. And for some reason, there's a lot more distortion options in the grid than there is actually with Bitwig in itself. I don't know why, but we can use a wave shaper, we can use the Chebyshev, we can use distortion, hard clip, quantizer, rectifier, saturator, etc. I think that I'm probably just going to use a wave shaper here, and I'm just going to create a nice saturation curve like this to where you make this line convex, and then we can just kind of listen to how that sounds. Now something else that we can do to tame all this, because we've already got all of the crazy complex movement, is we can actually grab another filter here. We're going to move this over to the side right there, and we are going to set this to just a low pass 1 and pull this up all the way. And now what I'll do is duplicate this modulator here, and I'm going to turn this one off and turn this one on. So that way, whenever this turns on, it's actually going to modulate everything all the way down to like 100 hertz or so. So that way we have a little bit of extra control in order to create even more interesting movement. I think I went a little bit too far with that, but that's okay. I'm just gonna back off of this just a tad, so that way it just shaves off some of those harsh frequencies that we have up above. Now the crazy thing, of course, is that you can continue to make this as complex as you want, but between doing this, you see how it gives you a starting place. It gives you a really cool immediate sound out of the box, and then all you have to do is start to slowly add to it and add to it and add to it. And then once you have all that stuff, you can convert everything into the grid and continue to make patches or make a generative thing or do whatever it is that you want within something like that in itself. So hopefully you see how many possibilities you have within this. And then when you consider stuff that I have, maybe let's say like if you were to purchase the Aegis pack off of my website, imagine what you could do with, you know, something that sounds maybe in the midst of like this. Hold on one second. Let me pull up something that I really like. So you turn all of these on. And then you take all that and then you go right click, transfer it into the grid, and then you keep working and making the patch more complex in its own right. Then you have a lot of power to play with at your fingertips. So that's pretty much it. I hope that you guys have a new perspective, or at least a deeper perspective on Polymer. I would highly suggest that you get your hands in and just get going and make patches in it, even if they're simple, because they scale. And there's a lot more that you can always do with them in that way, even though on the surface it's like, oh, I only have a filter. I've only got some light FM. It's like, no, no, no. It's not designed like that. It's designed for you to take a simple piece and then add these modules to it to make it more complex as we demonstrated through the video. So thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. And if you would like to support the channel, you can either A, become a member, or you can consider making a purchase off of my website. Thanks everybody. I'll see you in the next one.